clear that the fundamental idea of anarchism is the primacy of the individual, not necessarily in isolation, but with other individuals, and the fulfillment of his freedom. This, in a sense, looks awfully like the founding ideas of the United States of America. Now, what is it about the American experience which has made freedom, as used in that tradition, become a suspect and indeed a tainted phrase in the minds of anarchists and libertarian socialist thinkers like yourself?
Well, many anarchists, let me just say I don't really regard myself as an anarchist thinker. I'm a derivative fellow traveler, let's say. Anarchist thinkers have constantly referred to the American experience and to the ideal of Jeffersonian democracy very, very favorably. However, Jefferson's concept that the best government is government which governs least, or Thoreau's addition to that the best government is the one that doesn't govern at all, is one that's often repeated by anarchist thinkers through modern times. However, the concept of Jeffersonian democracy, putting aside the fact that it was a slave society, developed in an essentially pre-capitalist system. That is, in a society in which there was no a monopolistic control of. There were no centers of private power, let's say, no significant centers of private power. In fact, it's striking to read today, to go back and to read some of the classic libertarian texts. If one reads, say, Wilhelm von Humboldt's Critique of the State in 1792, a work that certainly inspired Mill, and a significant classic libertarian text, he doesn't speak at all of the need to resist private concentration of power. Rather, he speaks of the need to resist the encroachment of coercive state power. And that is what one finds also in the early American tradition. But
that was the only kind of power there was.
The only kind of power there was. I mean, Humboldt takes for granted that individuals are roughly equivalent in their private power, and that the only real imbalance of power that one sees is the centralized authoritarian state, and individual freedom must be sustained against its intrusion. The state of the church, I mean, that's what he feels one must resist. Now, when he speaks, Humboldt, for example, of the need for control of one's creative life, or when he decries the alienation of labor that arises from coercion or even instruction or guidance in one's work rather than self-management in one's work, he's giving an anti-statist. He's developing an anti-statist or anti-theocratic ideology. But the same principles apply very well to the capitalist industrial society that emerged later. And I would think that Humboldt, had he been consistent, would have ended up being a libertarian socialist rather than the...
Don't these precedents suggest that there is something inherently pre-industrial about the applicability of libertarian ideas in this way, that it necessarily presupposes a rather rural, simple society in which the technologies of production are fairly simple, in which the economic organization tends to be small-scale and localized, and in which all the problems which we associate with modern industrial society just aren't there?
Well, let me separate that into two questions. One, how anarchists have felt about that, and two, what I think is the case. As far as anarchist reactions to that, there are two. There has been an anarchist tradition, which was, and one might think, say, of Kropotkin as a representative, which had much of the character that you described. On the other hand, there's another anarchist tradition that developed into anarcho-syndicalism, which simply regarded anarchist ideas as the proper mode of organization for a highly complex, advanced industrial society. And that tendency in anarchism merges, or at least interrelates very closely with a variety of left-wing Marxism, the kind that one finds in, say, the Council Communists that grew up in the Luxemburgian tradition and that is later represented by Marxist theorists like, say, Anton Pannekoek, and who developed a whole theory of workers' councils in industry and who was himself a scientist and astronomer, very much part of the industrial world, a Dutch Marxist. Now, it's the latter. Now, so which of these two views is correct? I mean, is it necessary that anarchist concepts belong to the pre-industrial phase of human society, or is it the rational mode of organization for a highly advanced industrial society? Well, I myself believe the latter. That is, I think that industrialization and the advance of technology raises possibilities for self-management over a broad scale that simply didn't exist in an earlier period. and that, in fact, this is precisely the rational mode for an advanced and complex industrial society, one in which workers can very well become masters of their own immediate affairs, that is, direction of and control of the shop, but also can be in a position to make the major substantive decisions concerning the structure of the economy, concerning social institutions, concerning planning regionally and beyond, because they can have, in fact, objectively now, that is, technology permits and industrialization permits, institutions do not permit them to have control over the requisite information, the relevant training to understand these matters. A good deal can be automated. Much of the necessary work that is required to keep a decent level of social life going can be really consigned to machines, at least in principle, which means humans can be free to undertake the kind of creative work which may not have been possible objectively in early stages of the Industrial Revolution.
I'd like to pursue in a moment the question of the economics of an anarchist society. But could you sketch in a little more broadly the kind of political constitution of an anarchist society as you would see it in modern conditions? Would there be political parties, for example? What forms of government, residual forms of government, would in fact remain?
Well, let me sketch what I think would be perhaps a rough consensus, and one that I think is essentially correct. Beginning with these two modes of immediate organization and control, namely organization and control in the workplace and in the community. One can imagine a network of workers' councils at a higher level, representation across a factory or across branches of industry or across crafts, and on to general assemblies of workers' councils that can be regional and national and international in character. And from another point of view, one can project a system of governance that involves local assemblies, again, federated regionally, dealing with regional issues, crossing crafts, industries, trades, and so on, and again, general at the level of the nation or beyond through federation and so on. Now, each of these, and exactly how these would develop and how they would interrelate and whether you need both of them or only one, well, these are matters over which anarchist theoreticians have debated, and many detailed proposals exist. And I don't feel competent to take a stand. In fact, I think these are questions that pretty much would have to be worked out.
But there would not, for example, be direct national elections and political parties organized from coast to coast, as it were, or from north to south in Britain to win those kind of elections? Would that? Because if there were, that would presumably create a kind of a central authority which would be equal to the idea of anarchism.
Right. No, the idea of anarchism is that delegation of authority is rather minimal. That is, participants at any one of these levels of government, representatives at any one of these levels of government, should be directly responsive to the organic community in which they live. And in fact, the optimal situation would be that participation in one of these levels of government should, on the one hand, be temporary, and even during the period when it's taking place, should be only partial. That is, the members of Workers' Council who are, for some period, actually functioning to make short-run decisions that other people don't have the time to make, should nevertheless be, in part, also continuing to do their work as part of the workplace or neighborhood community in which they belong. Now, as for political parties, my feeling is that an anarchist society would not forcefully prevent the political parties from arising. In fact, anarchism has always been based on the idea that any sort of Procrustean bed, any sort of system of norms that's imposed on social life will constrain and very much underestimate its energy and vitality, and that all sorts of new possibilities of voluntary organization may develop that we may not even think of today at that higher level of material and intellectual culture. But I think it is fair to say that insofar as political parties are felt to be necessary, anarchist organization of society will have failed. That is, it should be the case, I would think, that where there is direct participation in self-management in economic and social affairs, then factions, conflicts, differences of interest and idea and opinion, which should be welcomed and cultivated, will be expressed at every one of these levels. Why they should fall into 2 or 3 or N political parties, I don't quite see. I think that the complexity of human interest in and life is